Hey guys, today I'm going to talk about a political theory called the divine right of kings, and I'm going to talk about what it was and its limitations. The divine right of kings is a political theory that came to great prominence during the 17th century in Europe, in an era dominated by monarchies. The doctrine was a defense of absolute monarchism, a system where all power in the state is centralized on one monarch. The divine right asserted that the legitimacy of a king's rule was bestowed by God himself, and that this divine power was shared by no other earthly authority. This assertion was argued through use of the Bible, with God's establishment of Solomon as the king of Israel used as a precedent. Kings took on a holy quality, as they were his lieutenants on earth. This quality was reflected in the buildings monarchs lived in, with political power taking on a visual form. In France, for example, the palace at Versailles was filled with paintings showing the king in various heroic settings. All around the building was embossed with King Louis's personal emblem, the sun. This was copied across Europe, with monarchs reflecting their standing in the architecture around them, building similar palaces modelled on Versailles. And what of accountability? According to divine right, a king could never be held accountable for their actions by anyone but God himself. Any government institution had no right to hold any sway over the monarch, such as in a constitutional monarchy like England. There, monarchs needed to get the consent from Parliament to enact a new law. In France, an absolute monarchy, the king did not and could refuse any legislation that he considered to be harmful to the interests of the crown. Some political thinkers, such as James I, went as far as proclaiming kings were not just the almighty lieutenants on earth, but were called God by God himself. James I believed that any attempt to dethrone a king would constitute sacrilege. Subjects who found themselves suffering at the hands of a monarch should simply suffer in silence and should never rebel. This belief was pervasive across Europe at the time and suited James I, as it just so happened he was king of Scotland, England, and Ireland. In essence, the divine right to rule was a justification for a God-ordained dictatorship. However, even for absolute monarchs, their power did have some social limitations. What laid the foundation for these limitations was the recognition that it is God whom they receive their powers from. While the divine right of kings allowed them to stand above any other man or institution, kings were still answerable to God. Monarchs were placeholders for God on earth, whose will they exercised. This meant that they were required to guide their governing with God's teachings, in theory. If kings acted contrary to God's teachings, divine judgment would be brought down on them. This could come in many forms, such as rebellions against the king. As rebellions were an evil that subjects were barred from doing, according to the terms of the divine right to rule, it could only occur with divine permission. In essence, a king was restricted insofar as they could not go against Christian teachings publicly, as they were required to carry out God's will. There was also the sense that a king could not go against the natural law, and his actions must be subject to reason. This was often wrapped up in parental language, with the king's relationship with his subjects likened to a father and his child's. For example, pamphlets published in opposition to the King of France during the 17th century called on the king to act like a responsible father, but not for a legal limit on his powers. Furthermore, a king could not use their power for their own personal gain. They were required to employ it with restraint and fear, with the acknowledgement that they were still answerable to God for their actions. Jacques Bousset, a 17th century political thinker, an open supporter of the divine right to rule, expresses this clearly in his influential work, Politics Drawn from the Very Words of Scripture. According to Bousset, the heaviest punishment awaited a king that uses his position for his own gain. To him, the use of God-given power for evil is sacrilege. A king is not answerable to anyone but God, who will not be merciful of you if you fail to exercise his will correctly. Additionally, while no one on earth could require a king to follow such laws, he nevertheless should act as if they applied to him, not just to please God, but because he should set a good example for his subjects, and because a king should prefer the goods of the state over their own personal interests. In fact, he should view the general good as his own, as to paraphrase a quote often attributed to Louis, "A king is the state." The divine right of kings, then, was a justification of monarchism, a system of government pervasive in 17th century Europe. It argued that a king's power is given to him by God, which elevated a monarch above any other earthly institution. Although this rationale bestowed great power on royalty, a monarch did have some limitations on how they exercised their power. Foremost, a king had to exercise his powers with humility, in recognition that he is carrying out the will of God. Furthermore, the source of their power was God, and as such had to govern through Christian teachings. These teachings could not be acted against, as it originated from the same source of their power. Additionally, a king, while not accountable to laws on earth, should act as if he was. This was to set a good example for his subjects, and that he should follow laws regardless of his status. He should also not abuse his powers for his own personal gain, but use it for the good of the state. In essence, a king's rule should not be godless nor lawless. These limits were not legally binding, however, but more driven by social expectations. Thanks very much, guys, and I'll see you next time.